but we'll be strict with the papers. Okay, let's begin. So today we begin the book that deals with monetary, international monetary regime, money and finance. This is the chapter 4 in the book, and we will be reading the first part of this chapter that deals with, say, international finance. International finance and monetary regimes. And it does two things, actually. We're going to be talking mostly about two things. The first thing is the historical comparison or comparative analysis of different international monetary regimes from the 19th century onwards with regard to the three criteria. So we can make two grids, actually. On the one hand, the first, second, third, and fourth monetary regimes that existed. Different economic regimes in general and monetary, international monetary regimes. The first is the laissez-faire system of the 19th century, which in monetary terms was based on which kind of monetary system?
Gold standard.
Gold standard, yeah.
Exactly, so that's the first one, gold standard.
Then you have the second system from 1914 to 1945, which is a protectionist, nationalist, or statist system, which is based on fiat money. Going off the gold standard. After 1945, what is the monetary system? But after that, what is it called?
Non-monetary system.
It's not a pure gold standard, but some kind of modified gold standard. It's called Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods system. Gold exchange standards. So it's not a pure gold standard, but gold exchange standard. And eventually you have this, he calls it a non-system, essentially fiat money system, once again. So this is the first thing, the analysis of these four types of regimes with regard to three criteria or three theoretical concepts. The first one is fixed versus flexible exchange rates. That's the first aspect of international monetary system. Well, international exchange rates. Then monetary independence of domestic institutions, central banks. To what extent you can conduct your independent monetary policy irrespective to what other people do. Third, free mobility of capital or lack thereof. Can you move financial capital across national borders? Are there any obstacles or impediments to that or not? That's the first part of our analysis. The second important topic is the business cycle theory. business cycle theory, the causes of business cycle and the remedies for it. And the two he mentions in the book and talks to a certain degree about the two specific, actually three, but one of them is a conventional theory that is taken for granted. That's a Keynesian theory. Can you read this? Yeah. Maybe I should pick slightly dark font. What I got from a student, actually, because I was always didn't have a marker, and I got present says to carry with you. I'm a caricature of an absent-minded professor. Most extreme form. Okay, Keynesianism. This should be better here. The second one is monetarism. And the third one is the classical theory. Classical. So let's call also Austrian. And you will remember now Rothbard and his theory of business cycle. That's it. This one doesn't work. Let's go back to the previous one. Austria. Okay. So now, can we disentangle the gold standard? What kind of combination gold standard has? Exchange rate is fixed. Yeah, fixed. Why is exchange rate fixed with the gold standard?
There's a certain amount of gold at a certain time.
What is the monetary unit under the gold standard? Any monetary unit, different monetary units. Yeah, there's certain quantities of gold that are arbitrarily set. So then the exchange rate between the two different national currencies is just a mathematical ratio of two different quantities of gold. Of course, they have to be fixed. If you define American dollar, I'm not saying that this is the real weight, just for instance, but 1.3 gram of gold and 1 pound sterling, I don't know what the sign is, 2.6 gram of gold, then the exchange rate is 1 to 2. And it cannot change unless the government changes the definition of monetary unit. That doesn't have any reason to do it. So the gold is the money, and different monetary units are just a conventional designations for a certain quantity of gold. So exchange rate is by definition, of course, fixed. Doesn't make any sense to talk about fluctuating dollar to the pound sterling would be just like Robert says in one book, like kilometer fluctuating against the mile. Two different measures of the same thing. Doesn't make any sense. They are fixed. They're defined. What about monetary policy? Independence of the central bank. Monetary. There is no independence. Of course, a very limited scope for monetary policy. Why is that the case? You increase the money supply in your country, what's going to happen?
Prices will slowly rise.
The domestic prices will start increasing. What happens next?
Will people exchange their money?
Well, gold is money. Increase the quantity of gold. Domestic prices increase because the quantity of money is higher. The more money chasing the same quantity of goods, prices of goods and services go up. International money is gold. You use gold to pay for foreign goods, and you receive gold when you sell domestic goods. So what happens is that your exports decreases. Your balance of payment to foreign countries declines. Which means that if your domestic prices increase, if you try to manipulate domestic money supply by increasing domestic prices, you're going to face a situation in which your export goods will be more expensive, of course. So foreigners will be buying less goods from you, and domestic economic agents will be buying more import goods. So then you will have the outflow of gold, which will put a check in your inflation policy. You don't have to stop face an outflow of gold, because the money supply will decrease. Any attempt, this is called the specie of flow mechanism, discovered by David Hume in the 18th century. Specie of flow mechanism. Specie means like a commodity, gold and silver. So increase domestic monetary prices, the cost of that is actually that your import will increase and export will decrease, because the foreign goods will be, the relative prices of foreign and domestic goods will change. The imported goods will be relatively more attractive for domestic agents, and domestic goods will be less attractive for foreigners. So then you import more than you export, which means that you're paying in gold to foreigners more than you receive in gold from foreigners. That means the outflow of gold. If you try to deflate the money supply, reduce the quantity of money, to reduce your prices, what happens then? Your goods become cheaper. Deflation. Less money, lower quantity of money, chasing the same amount of goods, domestic prices go down. Domestic prices going down, domestic goods become more attractive for domestic economic agents, export decreases, and also they become more attractive for foreigners, because the relative prices of domestic and foreign goods move in your direction. So foreigners want to buy more, less expensive American goods. So what is the consequence of that? You try to reduce prices and you try to reduce the money supply. Eventually, you end up importing more gold. The gold inflow, when export increases vis-a-vis imports, you import more gold. So this automatic character of gold standard prevents any activist monetary policy. You cannot conduct your independent monetary policy. Eventually, you're going to be punished by it. In whichever direction that you are pushing, the market, international market, will bring you back to the equilibrium. So, no activist monetary policy is likely to be successful in the gold standard. Freedom of movement, of course, free movement of capital. No capital controls. So what are capital controls? Restrictions in moving financial capital across national borders. So now, what about the second period, 1914 to 1945? Exchange rates.
Not as fixed.
Yeah. Devaluations, still in principle fixed, but sometimes changed by the governments. So that means you inflate, you print the paper money during the war. After the war, you devalue your currency to take account. So kind of not as fixed exchange rates, less stable exchange rates. Monetary independence, yes, more monetary independence. to the degree that you go off the gold standard, you have then a greater ability to conduct monetary policy. So yes, monetary independence. What about the freedom of movement of capital? Yeah, many restrictions. Second World War. You don't trade with Russians and with Germans and with Italians, of course. So, capital restrictions. Bretton Woods. What about Bretton Woods system? So what was the essence of the Bretton Woods arrangement? How did you understand this explanation? So this is a relatively difficult chapter. The language is a little bit technical. So I'm wondering how well do you understand this? What is the difference between the classical gold standard and this gold exchange standard after 1945? So the exchange rate.
Was it fixed?
It's fixed, okay? Yeah. How? So US dollar, so essentially fixed to US dollar. So US dollar is fixed vis-a-vis gold. Gold is still theoretically money, but then most transactions are not in gold. Other currencies are not directly tied to gold. Other currencies are tied to American dollar. So that means if you want to devalue your currency, you theoretically can do it. You need just the reserves, dollar reserves to get it. You need the dollars from Americans, and then you can. So some level of monetary independence for most countries, except for America. Much less in America, because the dollar is tied to gold, and most other countries' currencies are pegged. It's called pegged to dollar, which means a fixed exchange ratio, 1 to 7. That could be, and sometimes it is called a dirty peg. Dirty peg, which means that it could be changed. Now, when it will be changed? Do you notice that? An explanation how, when, and in which type of situations the exchange ratio would be allowed to fluctuate, to change. National banks of different countries would be allowed to change the exchange ratio. Now, the Keynesian theory comes along here. So remember, the Keynesian theory argues that market is inherently unstable and that the government intervention is necessary to prevent recessionary shocks in business cycle, or at least to moderate, to mitigate those. And one of the main reasons why market itself cannot eliminate a business cycle is the price and wage rigidities, sticky prices. You know what is that? Sticky prices. So when the economy is in a downturn, the most obvious way of solving the problem would be for all prices and wages to decline gradually. If the economy declines by 10%, increasing wages 10% across the board would prevent the unemployment crisis. So one of the most problematic aspects of a recession is an increase in unemployment. And Keynesian theory is that the main reason for a disproportionately high increase in unemployment during recession is that the wages are sticky, rigid. Long-term contracts, they cannot adjust. They're not flexible enough to decrease during recession. Partially because they're sticky to begin with, because people want predictable long-term prices. Wage contracts are by and large fixed. Partially because the trade unions make them such, even more so. By resisting the wage reductions in the period of recession. So now, what is the alternative solution? Would be then to increase the nominal spending, to increase the money supply, to overcome the resistance of the fixed and high wages. To prevent the unemployment, you need an increase in aggregate spending in the economy. You need to increase the nominal income country, and in order to do so, you have to devalue the currency. You need to undergo a devaluation of domestic currency, which means to change the exchange ratio in coordination with Americans in the international market. In order to print more currency and to retain the same ratio, you need more dollar reserves from the American government. Now, the problem with this is that in order to do so, you need to prevent the capital, like speculative attacks. You need the speculative attacks, capital controls. Since the ratio is fixed between the dollar and other currency, then speculators, if they anticipate an increase in dollar reserves, so the same exchange rate, if you want to print more domestic currency, you need more dollars. That's the essence of the transaction. If speculators anticipate that more dollar reserves are forthcoming, what are they going to do? They're going to be selling domestic currency, buying dollars. What is going to be the consequence of that? Selling off. You want to increase the quantity of domestic currency, people are selling off domestic currency, reduction in the domestic quantity. So then in order for this entire operation to be successful, you need to prevent these speculative attacks. Why would speculators be selling now the domestic currency? Because it will be worth less, more than new dollars. Confused the economy. So capital controls is a regulations or limitations in how much capital, how much currency could be moving across the national border is a necessary side effect or byproduct of this gold exchange ratio, gold exchange Bretton Woods system. So it goes with certain level of monetary independence, capital controls, and fixed exchange rate. So that's a combination here. Finally, this modern system it broke Eventually, the system was destroyed in 1971, what Richard Nixon said. One of the disadvantages of the system was that America was incapable of devaluating its own currency. It was stifled. And America in the 1960s did two things that were very expensive. One of them was the Vietnam War, and the second one was Medicare, Medicaid, welfare state expansion. Both of them tremendously expensive. You cannot finance it by devaluing your currency as other countries did. So inflation started increasing in America. So Richard Nixon went off the gold standard. Said, forget about it, we're not going to underwrite the system anymore. So now we have a system in which there is no connection between gold and national currencies of any sort. Quantity of money fluctuates depending on the decisions of domestic central banks, whether to increase or decrease the money supply. Now that's a textbook macroeconomic situation that you remember in macro class. Open market operations, manipulations of interest rates determine the quantity of money. What is the exchange rate? Exchange system? What determines the exchange rates between how the relative prices of different currencies are determined? What determines the exchange rate? It's flexible or freely fluctuating. Exchange rate. Which means essentially the monetary policies of different central banks determine the relative prices of different currencies. It could be 1, 2, 1 point, then it shifts to 1.1 to 1.6. Depends on how aggressive or how conservative a given central bank is. I remember in 2004, 2005, American dollar was exchanging out 1-to-1 against euro. Or even more, you needed 1.2 euro for $1. And then Alan Greenspan started anti-recessionary policy, devaluing the base of the American dollar. And eventually in 2010, it was like 1.6, 1.5, $1.6 for €1. Because the Europeans were much more conservative. The European Central Bank is by and large run by Germans, who are extremely wary of inflation. And in America, there was this orgy of quantitative easing and money printing bonanza. So the American dollar devalued vis-a-vis euro. So this depends purely and solely on the decisions of central banks, how much money to print. There is no intrinsic value in the currency anymore. There is not even a tenuous connection or indirect connection between dollar and monetary unit. It's just, this is fiat money imposed by the government. Can you do independent monetary policy now? Yeah, in principle, yes. Much more so than in the gold standard. And yet there are some checks, even here. So what happens if you have a trade deficit? If a country has a deficit on the what is called the current account, which which means the balance of payments for goods and services. Let's say that America has a deficit, trade deficit with China. So how Chinese exporters export goods in America, how they import it. What is the currency that you use to pay American goods? Yeah. It's dollar. You're a Chinese, you export your goods, you sell them in America, you get dollars. You're American, you sell American goods in China, you get yens. So if America has if China has a trade surplus with America, what does that mean? It means when you balance the accounts, you have extra dollars. Chinese exporters, Chinese economic agents have some extra dollars. So what can they do with these extra dollars? They're not going to buy American goods and services because they're more expensive. What else can they do? Yeah, you can invest it. So eventually what you have is that the deficit on a trade account, on a balance of payments, or what is called the current account deficit will be balanced by a surplus on a capital account. Which means that the Chinese who are selling more Chinese goods to Americans than they're buying from Americans will have extra dollars that they will have to spend somehow. So they will either, one solution is that they don't want to invest in America. But they have to get rid of their dollars. They're useless, they cannot do anything. So they can sell dollars to somebody else for third currency, for some other currency, and then whoever buys dollars from them, eventually at the end of the road, somebody will have to do something. If you buy dollars from somebody, that means that you need it for something. Eventually, dollars will find their way back to America. If people will not buy goods and services, they will buy other things, stocks and bonds, real estate, all kinds of things. So then, the fact that the main creditors of American federal government are Chinese and Japanese, the same people who have trade surplus with America, are just the two sides of the same coin. So trade deficit means investment surplus on the investment account, on the capital account. So then what you do in this system of flexible exchange rates, if you try to devalue domestic currency. So what is the justification for the policy of devaluation is actually to make domestic prices more competitive. To stimulate the export. So if you succeed by monetary policy in reducing the gap, eliminating trade surplus, what you're going to be doing at the same time, you're going to be eliminating the surplus investment. Okay. So you can do it essentially, theoretically. You have the instruments of monetary policy that to do. That's the difference vis-a-vis the gold exchange system, but the market slaps you very quickly. Here you can do it theoretically. You can try and eliminate the trade deficit, but that doesn't make much sense from a broader economic point of view, because eventually what you do, you're eliminating capital account surplus. You're eliminating foreign investment in your country. So every Chinese and Japanese buying American stocks and bonds as a consequence of the trade deficit that America has with them is more investment and more higher wages and more new jobs for Americans here. So less trade deficit means less surplus dollars for Chinese, Japanese, and others that they're going to reinvest in America, so less jobs and less additional investment and productivity in America as well. So this is this broken window fallacy, another instance of that. So you see the effects of eliminating trade deficit, domestic firms, domestic exports increases, imports decreases, so GDP will increase. Remember, definition of GDP in the short run is consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports, which is the difference between export and import. So you eliminate the trade deficit, you increase this net exports component of GDP. So in the accounting sense, in the short run, you're going to be better off. And I will say, see, great thing. Tariffs, for example. Tariffs or monetary policy, devaluing domestic currency. Whatever policy you use to reduce trade deficit will, in the short run, increase your GDP. Because imports will decrease, export will increase, and your net exports will be higher. Your trade deficit will be lower, or your trade surplus will be higher. For that. The balance will positive direction, increasing your GDP. But what is the flip side of that? The flip side of that is that the long-term investment will be undermined, reduced. Stocks and bonds of domestic corporations will be the sales of stocks and bonds and investment in stocks and bonds will go down, corporate bonds, stocks, and investment in government bonds will go down. So this will affect all three components here of GDP. Government spending will be less because the public debt will be lower. The ability of government to borrow will be lower. Government will borrow less, and government spending will be lower. Investment spending will be lower because less foreign money for stocks and bonds, less money for stocks and bonds, less internal growth of corporations, and eventually even consumer spending. So see, what is seen, the main difference is that this is seen here. This is short-term effect that is easier to identify empirically, whereas these effects will be more long-term and more difficult to identify. Okay, so independent monetary policy is possible, but it's kind of sketchy and problematic. Capital controls, no, free movement. Free movement. You don't need any capital controls. See, whatever happens, international currency market can regulate the
System successfully, there are no problems of speculative attacks. Similar things.
So you see that eventually modern monetary system combines freedom of international trade and freedom of international transfers of capital, flexible, freely fluctuating exchange rates, and independent monetary policy. One exception to this is that many developing countries still have fixed exchange rates. So if you have a country, this was the experience of many Eastern European and Latin American countries, country with a history of inflation, history of irresponsible monetary policy. They very often opt for something called currency board. currency boards. So currency board essentially is a system in which you retain your domestic currency, but it is pegged against dollar or euro. 1 to 12. For every dollar, 12 peso, or 12, whatever the Argentinian currency is. So the domestic central bank, although still exists, doesn't have the ability to increase or decrease the monetary supply independently. So eventually you still have domestic currency, you're not paying in dollars, but it is pegged to dollar. So you actually outsource monetary policy to the central bank. The quantity of peso will fluctuate in accordance with the fluctuations of dollar. So that's the only exception. Most countries in the modern world in the last 50 years or so, 45 or 50 years, have flexible exchange rates, which means that they have independent central banks with the full authority to change the quantity of money, except in some cases that you have a currency board regimes in which domestic currency is fixed vis-a-vis some established currency. Typically, in Europe, it was the German mark. Before the European unification, before euro became the European currency, German mark was the dominant currency in Eastern Europe. So Bulgaria and Romania and a couple of other Eastern European countries during the 1990s, because they had currency boards in which whatever the Bulgarian lev was fixed at the exchange rate, whatever it was, 25 lev for one German mark or something like that. So in Serbia, we didn't have a currency board. Of course, we had the hyperinflation, but nevertheless, the German mark was the unofficial currency. Actually, all prices were expressed in mark. Ever since the euro was adopted, euro became an informal currency because all of these countries have a relatively high inflation rate, and then most of domestic prices, especially prices of things like real estate or cars, loans, are denominated in euros or Swiss francs. So for lower price, just like remember gold, silver, and copper. Actually, big investment is in gold, like a domestic, like regular daily transactions in silver, and very small change in copper. Something similar is in Eastern Europe. Everything important, long-term investment is always indexed, expressed in hard currency, in euro or Swiss marks, and only domestic prices of consumer goods and everyday stuff is denominated in dinars or levs or whatever. So you see, there are some additional limitations in monetary policy, policies of Eastern European countries and all other developing countries. So if you have to pay, you take a loan for a house, for example, and which is in dinars, but it's indexed in Swiss francs. So whatever the exchange rate was at the point when you took the loan, it's still worth a certain amount of Swiss francs. And if the exchange rate had fallen, if the dinar was devaluated, as likely to happen, if your salary of your income in dinars didn't increase, stuff like you have to pay instead of 60% of your salary for a credit rate. Monthly, you pay 75%. So it happened to many people in Serbia. It's horrible. 5 or 10 years ago, they didn't read the fine print in their contracts. It's a relatively good period in economic development. The wages went up, and people got greedy. Now I'm going to buy a new house, new car, forever. And then the value of dinar started going down slightly. And the loans were denominated in Swiss francs, which is the hardest of the hard currencies, actually. It's like 0% inflation per year. It's just like a gold. and then your rate went up from 5,000 dinars per month to 7,000 dinars. Many people had to sell houses, sell the cars because they couldn't keep up with the rates. So you see, one of the perks of stable money is overall financial and economic stability, something that people in the Western world take for granted, and which is not to be taken for granted. Okay, any questions, any comments about this, or about anything else? Business cycle theory. Can you tell me something about that? You read that? Can you share with us any thoughts, any comments?
Kind of related with like Rothbard's point.
Uh-huh.
You read about like boom and bust cycle.
Boom and bust cycle, yeah. It's a classical theory. What is the main cause, or the main causes according to this classical theory?
For profits.
Yeah. How does that work? Why the changes in profits are the instrument to which the business cycle is? A change in profits, that's one thing, and there is another aspect here. Profits and interest rates. What is the relationship between the two? Why the business cycle is kind of related to the distortion in the relationship between interest rates and profits. So what happens in the initial phase of the boom?
There's a lot of profits and then
The profits go up,
a lot more investment.
lot more investment. Profits, especially in the long-term business projects, profits go up. People hire more people, invest more, business projects grow. It is guaranteed by artificially low interest rates. That's the relationship. Lower interest rates send a signal that there is more investment available. There is more savings available for long-term business projects. Profit rates go up for a while. Why this cannot last? Why this phenomenon cannot last forever? So you have fixed resources. Resources cannot be arbitrarily increased in the short run. In other words, you cannot just by waving your magic wand increase the quantity of workers, number of workers, or the machines, or the other real factors of production that you need. It's all completely fixed. And you increase by leaps and bounds the number and the size and the scope of your business projects. So there is then competition for the resources, for the labor, the capital. So what's going to happen in the long run to the profit margins? So profit is a difference between revenue and cost. Then there is this phase of the business cycle. So initially, at the beginning, revenue goes up, people are optimistic, cheaper loans, more money, more credit, prices go up, profit margins increase. But as time goes by, what happens? This scramble for resources. People start slowly realizing that there is not enough resources to complete all of these business projects. So the competition for labor increases, the demand for labor increases, the demand for capital, machinery, equipment, raw materials increases. demand increases, price quantity, this is demand 1, this is the supply. Supply is fixed. Let's say in the short run. Supply curve, short run supply curve is fixed. You cannot change it. You cannot just invent 200,000 new workers to complete all business projects. Imagine that you have 20% more business projects that you can complete. So then demand increases. So what's going to happen? Here is the price of labor or price of machinery. Price will go up. So prices of labor will go up, prices of machinery will go up, prices of land will go up, prices of raw material will go up. What are these? These are our costs here. So costs of production go up. That's the problem. Because of artificially low interest rates, in the initial phase of the business cycle, people are encouraged to overinvest, to overextend, especially to extend when it comes to the long-term business projects. That's the key. Projects that take a lot of time to complete. They're much more sensitive to the interest rate fluctuations than the short-term business projects. So they increase investment in the long-term projects without reducing short-term projects. That's the key. When you increase saving, when the fall in the interest rate is caused by a change in time preference, then people reduce consumption or reduce investment in short-term business projects and increase investment in long-term business projects. Okay? Time preference means how impatient about the future you are. When your rate of time preference goes down, that means that society as a whole is ready to wait more for income, for consumption. That means we're gonna sacrifice a little bit of short-term satisfaction, short-term consumer goods, and we're gonna wait more for a larger quantity of consumer goods in the future. But if no change in time preferences happens, and the new credit was created just out of thin air by government monetary policy, then you will have an overextension of these long-term business projects without an appropriate reduction in short-term productivity. So that's the reason why you will have this scramble for resources, because you need resources to complete the short-term projects and have much more long-term projects that you can complete with the available resources. So the price will increase then, and the cost will increase, and as a consequence, the profit margins will start going down. And this is the beginning of a recession eventually. When the profit margins go below zero or around zero, then bankruptcies will ensue, reductions and cutting back, cutting down, liquidation of excessive investment, especially these long-term business projects. The liquidation will be much higher in these areas. Unemployment will increase, so that's a recession. It's a correction of this initial unjustified expansion of business investment that shouldn't have taken place to begin with. So see this interface between interest rates, costs of production, and profits in the classical theory leads to the business cycle. The main cause of that is government. Expansionary monetary policy or credit policy that lowers the interest rates artificially is the main reason for business cycle. And then consequently, the solution for the problem is not to print money or to increase spending, is just to let the system liquidate the cancerous tissue, this excessive and harmful investment that should have been undertaken at all and that could not be completed successfully. Okay, what about the monetarist policy? What is their main diagnosis? What is the cause of the business cycle and what is the solution of the business cycle? Yes, the concept of natural interest rate here. That's something that he talks about. So you know what is that natural interest rate? So there wouldn't be a business cycle if interest rate is natural, which means interest rate is just dictated by the time preference and by the available amount of saving. That means the society as a whole wants to save 10% of its income and 90% of it to consume. Then the interest rate that follows from 10% saving rate will be a natural rate of interest. Whatever the amount of money. So natural interest rate will be determined by supply of loans dictated only by the time preference. Government doesn't do anything. But no, demand. Supply dictated only by the time preference and demand. This is the price of money or interest rate. This is the quantity of loans. That's the equilibrium in the financial market. It's Wicksell. Knut Wicksell is the inventor of this concept, and later on it would be used, of course, by Ludwig von Mises. Mises is a Wickellian. Ludwig von Mises. It's sometimes called the Wicksell-Mises theory of business cycle. You see, for changes in interest rate will have a systematic effect on the pattern of prices which allocate resources among different stages of production. In modern terminology, a fall in the interest rate due to credit expansion, this is the credit expansion which is not dictated by savings rate, but rather by the new paper credit, will lead to lower interest rates and higher quantity of loans in the short term, of course. Will lead to businesses undertaking relatively more capital-intensive investment projects with lower prospective rates of return. The artificially low rate of interest induced by injecting money through credit expansion will also lead to an unsustainable boom as more investment projects are undertaken, they can be completed. And as the accompanying resource scarcities emerge, so resource scarcities that emerge, that's this scramble for raw materials, scramble for workers, scramble for machinery, the boom turns into a bust. That's a short story. What about monetarism? It's the stabilizationist doctrine, which means that the precondition of macroeconomic stability is stable consumer prices. It's the main CPI. CPI consumer price index should be stable. So as long as you have stable prices, it doesn't matter whether you have a credit expansion or not. So here, monetary policy in classical and Austrian Wicksell business theory works through the credit market, through the interest rate. The main lever of monetary policy, the main instrument through which the money supply, changes in money supply affect production and investment are interest rates. Here, it's not the credit market, it's not the interest rate, it's the quantity of money. Quantity of money. is the key category. And stable prices. Quantity of money should be changed in such a way as to follow the changes in productivity. In order to have stable prices, quantity fluctuations in quantity of money have to match the fluctuations in real productivity of goods and services. That's the ideal of monetary policy. So, since the monetary policy has to be prospective, which means you have to set it for the next 6 months or 1 year, you cannot predict what the real productivity will be. That's the ideal, is to have stable prices, but you have to decide right now how many dollars to print, and the economy will, of course, do whatever it does in the next period. So then, how to achieve this goal technically? The goal is to have stable prices, zero inflation rate. Different techniques are proposed. Usually these are the certain goals. How much money supply, how much money supply should increase at any given point. So, the most famous was the 3% rule by Milton Friedman, who looked at the historical data about the increase in real physical productivity of the economy. And he realized that over the 20th century, the average rate of growth of real production in America was about 3%, even in the 19th century. That's a long-term average. It will fluctuate up or down in some years, but that's the average. He said that maybe the best monetary policy that we could have would be to just say, let's increase the money supply on average 3% per year. So in some years you will have some inflation, in some years you will have deflation, then, but on average the prices will not change very much over a longer period of time. So that's a stabilizationist policy. They hate each other with guts, the Austrians and monetarists. They disagree absolutely. So Hayek is one of the harshest critics of monetarism. He said, this thing was responsible for the Great Depression, because over the period of 1920s, Milton Friedman's idol and teacher, Irving Fisher, his policy was stabilizationist policy was drawing paradigm, and Federal Reserve worried only about stable prices. And the price level was stable indeed. But the problem was that during 1920s, roaring 20s, productivity was very high. So then what happens in 1920s that huge credit inflation and monetary inflation, money supply was increasing dramatically, was masked by very high productivity rate. So there was an excessive amount of dollars, an excessive amount of credit in the economy, which was masked by very high productivity rate of the economy. So you had the zero consumer price index increase, but you still have a huge inflationary increase in the money supply, which creates all kinds of dislocations to the economy, including business cycle. And he said their misguided stabilizationist policy was one of the causes of why the Great Depression happened. The problem was the boom, actually. The boom that lax easy money policy of 1920s created was the root cause of the subsequent bust and Great Depression. Whereas Friedman would say, no, what was the problem is that 1920s were perfect, stable prices. But then when the money supply started decreasing because of the banking and financial crisis, the problem was that the Federal Reserve from 1929 to 1933 didn't inflate too much. They couldn't engineer stable prices. That's the problem. Hayek and Friedman would say they inflated too much from 1922 to 1929. That's why you had a crash. And this is the explanation, causal explanation here, this classical business cycle theory. Whereas Friedman and monetary say, no, they didn't inflate enough from 1929 to 1933. That's the difference. They couldn't make stable prices. The price level fell by two-thirds almost, 50, 60, 70% over the early 1930s. So these are some of the differences. So monetarists belong to this macroeconomic approach that you look at the general price level, general inflation, you want stable prices and so on. You believe that you can somehow control and manage the economy as a whole. Keynesians do it in a different way, whereas classicals, they look at the things from a microeconomic point of view. Individual prices, relative prices of goods and services. You shouldn't be using any general rule like stable prices in order to avoid the problem of business cycle. Okay. Any final questions? No. Okay, then I'll post today's discussion on Canvas. And please, if you haven't sent me yet your proposals, do it in the next few days. Proposals for the papers. I got one or two already, but if you haven't sent, then by all means do it as soon as possible.